Welcome to the infinite expanse of alien civilizations that populate Rick and Morty's multiverse. Tonight, we journey through dimensions filled with beings beyond human comprehension. From crystalline entities that exist in mathematical dimensions to gas-based life forms that think in colors. Each species represents a unique solution to the problem of existence, evolved across countless worlds under alien suns. Let these strange and wondrous creatures guide you toward peaceful rest as we explore their societies, technologies, and the complex relationships they've formed with Rick Sanchez across infinite realities. Settle in comfortably and let your mind drift among the stars. Welcome to the vast bureaucratic nightmare that became the Galactic Federation, a sprawling interstellar government whose reach extended across thousands of star systems and encompassed more alien species than any single mind could catalogue or comprehend. This massive political entity represented perhaps the most ambitious attempt at organized civilization the multiverse had ever witnessed, bringing together beings so fundamentally different from one another that their basic methods of existence defied translation into concepts that human consciousness could process without significant mental strain. The Federation emerged not through conquest or dramatic political revolution, but through the gradual recognition among countless alien civilizations that the challenges of interdimensional travel, resource management, and cosmic-scale threats required coordination on a scale that individual planetary governments could never hope to achieve. The founding species came together in what historians across multiple dimensions would later describe as the most complex diplomatic negotiation in recorded history, requiring the development of entirely new frameworks for communication, legal reasoning, and cultural accommodation that could bridge gaps between forms of consciousness as different as crystalline hive minds and gaseous individual entities. The member species of the Galactic Federation represented every conceivable solution to the fundamental problems of existence and consciousness that the universe had managed to evolve across billions of years of cosmic development. The Gromflomites, whose insectoid physiology and hierarchical social structure made them natural administrators and law enforcement agents, served as the Federation's primary interface with less organized civilizations and provided the disciplined military backbone that kept order across territories spanning multiple galaxy clusters. Their compound eyes could process information across spectrums that most species could not perceive, making them ideally suited for detecting the kind of dimensional anomalies and technological signatures that indicated Rick-level threats to Federation stability. The crystalline beings from the Proxima Centauri sectors existed as living geometric structures that thought in mathematical concepts too complex for biological brains to fully comprehend, but their ability to process vast quantities of data simultaneously made them invaluable for managing the Federation's economic systems and resource allocation algorithms. These entities experience time differently than most carbon-based life forms, existing partially in multiple temporal dimensions simultaneously, which gave them unique insights into the long-term consequences of policy decisions and the ability to predict economic trends across timescales that span geological epochs. The gas giant dwellers, who had evolved in the atmospheric layers of planets with no solid surfaces, brought perspectives on community and individual identity that challenged every assumption about consciousness and social organization that other species had developed. These beings existed as complex patterns of electromagnetic activity within churning atmospheric systems, reproducing through the sharing and recombination of electrical patterns in ways that made concepts like individual identity and family structure completely fluid and contextual rather than fixed biological realities. The bureaucratic structure that the Federation developed to accommodate such radically different forms of consciousness was a masterpiece of administrative complexity that operated through layers of translation and interpretation, so elaborate that simple policy decisions often required months of processing through committees composed of beings whose basic methods of communication were fundamentally incompatible. The central government maintained vast databases of cultural and biological information about each member species, employing specialist interpreters who had dedicated their entire careers to understanding the subtle nuances of how different forms of consciousness approached concepts like law, morality, and civic responsibility. The political dynamics within Federation leadership reflected the ongoing tension between species that valued collective decision-making and those that were organized around individual authority figures, creating a system of governance that was simultaneously democratic and hierarchical, depending on which aspects of its operation were being examined. The Council of Representatives included beings who existed as collective consciousness entities speaking for entire planetary populations, alongside individual representatives from species where personal identity was considered the fundamental unit of political participation. Rick Sanchez's relationship with the Galactic Federation across multiple dimensions was characterized by the kind of casual contempt that only someone with his technological capabilities could maintain toward an organization that most civilizations regarded as the ultimate expression of cosmic authority and power. His ability to move freely between dimensions made him effectively immune to Federation jurisdiction, while his scientific knowledge exceeded anything their collective research institutions had managed to achieve. Despite having access to the combined intellectual resources of thousands of advanced civilizations, the economic systems that held the Federation together were based on interdimensional currency that derived its value from complex mathematical relationships between the fundamental constants of physics across different realities, creating a form of money that was literally universal in its application and acceptance. This currency enabled trade relationships between species whose basic resource needs were so different that conventional economic theory provided no framework for understanding how exchange could be mutually beneficial. But the Federation's economists had developed sophisticated models for calculating value that transcended simple supply and demand relationships. The Blemflarks, whose entire civilization was built around the cultivation and refinement of temporal energy, served as the Federation's primary banking institutions due to their natural ability to manipulate time flow in ways that enabled them to provide financial services across multiple temporal dimensions simultaneously. Their loans could be repaid in the past or future, depending on the borrower's temporal capabilities, and their interest calculations took into account the borrower's entire timeline rather than just their present financial circumstances. Law enforcement within the Federation required the development of legal frameworks that could address crimes committed across dimensional boundaries and involving forms of consciousness that experienced reality in fundamentally different ways. The Gromflamite peacekeeping forces were supplemented by specialized units composed of species with unique capabilities for dealing with specific types of interdimensional crime, including temporal smuggling, consciousness theft, and reality manipulation that threatened the stability of entire dimensional clusters. The prison systems operated by the Federation represented perhaps their most sophisticated achievement in cross-species cooperation, creating rehabilitation environments that could accommodate beings whose basic psychological and physiological needs were completely incompatible with traditional concepts of incarceration. Some species required collective imprisonment where individual identity was temporarily dissolved into group consciousness, while others needed complete sensory isolation to prevent their natural telepathic abilities from driving them insane through exposure to alien thought patterns. The collapse that Rick orchestrated through his manipulation of their currency valuation systems created cascading failures throughout Federation territory that affected billions of beings across hundreds of dimensions, demonstrating the vulnerability that came with the interconnectedness that made their civilization possible. The economic warfare that Rick conducted from within their own virtual interrogation systems was elegant in its simplicity, but devastating in its implications for species whose survival depended on the stability of Federation financial, institutions, and trade relationships. The aftermath of the Federation's collapse was marked by massive refugee crises as species that had become dependent on Federation infrastructure and support systems suddenly found themselves without the resources or organizational frameworks necessary for maintaining their civilizations at previous levels of complexity and comfort. Some species adapted by returning to pre-Federation social structures and technologies, while others attempted to maintain their accustomed standards of living through increasingly desperate measures that often led to conflicts with neighboring civilizations. The cultural exchanges that had flourished under Federation rule were abruptly terminated when the central government could no longer provide the translation services and diplomatic frameworks that had enabled peaceful interaction between radically different forms of consciousness. Species that had developed hybrid cultures combining elements from multiple alien traditions found themselves isolated between communities that could no longer communicate effectively with each other or with them. The technology sharing programs that had been one of the Federation's most successful initiatives became sources of conflict as different species attempted to maintain control over advanced technologies that had been developed through collaborative research projects. The standardization efforts that had enabled interspecies compatibility in everything from life support systems to communication protocols broke down as each species reverted to their own technological traditions and manufacturing standards. The Federation's approach to Rick-level threats had been based on containment and negotiation rather than direct confrontation, recognizing that beings with Rick's capabilities could not be controlled through conventional law enforcement methods, but might be managed through careful manipulation of their interests and relationships. The interrogation techniques they developed for dealing with Rick specifically were designed to exploit his psychological vulnerabilities rather than his technological weaknesses, but they fundamentally underestimated his willingness to sacrifice entire civilizations to achieve his personal objectives. The member species who had joined the Federation seeking protection from cosmic-scale threats found themselves more vulnerable after its collapse than they had been before its formation, as their traditional defense systems had been replaced by Federation military technology that they could no longer maintain or operate without central support. The collective security arrangements that had protected smaller civilizations from aggressive neighbors and interdimensional predators dissolved, along with the political structures that had sustained them. The reconstruction efforts that began in the aftermath of the Federation's collapse were hampered by the same fundamental communication and coordination problems that had made the original formation of the Federation such a remarkable achievement. Species that had learned to work together under Federation frameworks found themselves unable to maintain cooperative relationships without the institutional support and cultural translation services that the central government had provided. The long-term consequences of the Federation's destruction extended far beyond the immediate economic and political chaos to encompass fundamental changes in how different species approached the concepts of interstellar cooperation and collective governance. The failure of the Federation's ambitious attempt at universal civilization created skepticism about large-scale political projects that persisted across multiple generations and influenced the development of smaller, more culturally homogeneous alliances that were less vulnerable to the kind of systematic sabotage that Rick had employed. Some species emerged from the Federation's collapse with strengthened resolve, to maintain their independence and avoid the kind of interdependence that had made them vulnerable to cascading failures, while others became more desperate to find new forms of collective security that could protect them from threats they were unable to handle alone. The balance between cooperation and autonomy that each species struck in response to the Federation's failure would continue to influence interstellar politics across multiple dimensions for centuries after Rick's economic say. Warfare had reduced the galaxy's most successful civilization to a collection of isolated worlds struggling to maintain the achievements that collective action had made possible. The Cromulons emerged from the deepest reaches of interdimensional space as manifestations of cosmic consciousness, so vast and alien that their very existence challenged every assumption about the nature of intelligence and entertainment that civilizations across the multiverse had developed through millennia of cultural evolution. These planet-sized heads floating through the void represented a form of consciousness that operated on scales both temporal and spatial, that rendered individual planetary civilizations as brief, flickering moments of amusement in existences that spanned geological epochs and cosmic cycles, beyond the comprehension of beings whose lifespans were measured in mere decades or centuries. The interdimensional nature of the Cromulons defied conventional understanding of physics and consciousness, existing simultaneously across multiple realities, while maintaining coherent individual identities that could focus their attention on specific dimensions when particular forms of entertainment caught their cosmic interest. Their ability to manifest physically in any reality they chose while maintaining their essential existence in dimensions beyond normal space-time made them perhaps the most mysterious and unpredictable entities that Rick Sanchez had ever encountered in his extensive travels through the infinite possibilities of the multiverse. The origins of the Cromulons remained shrouded in cosmic mystery that even Rick's advanced scientific knowledge could not penetrate completely, though his observations suggested they had evolved from forms of consciousness that had transcended the limitations of planetary existence so completely that concepts like birth, death, and individual identity had become fluid categories, subject to conscious manipulation rather than biological inevitabilities. Their transformation from whatever they had originally been into cosmic-scale entertainment critics represented an evolutionary path so alien that it provided no useful analogies for understanding how consciousness might develop when freed from the constraints of physical embodiment and finite lifespans. Their planet-judging entertainment shows served purposes that extended far beyond simple amusement, functioning as cosmic evaluation systems that determined which civilizations possessed sufficient creative potential and cultural sophistication to warrant continued existence in realities where the Cromulons maintained influence. The phrase, "show me what you got," became a universal test of civilizational worthiness that forced entire planetary populations to distill their cultural achievements and creative capabilities into performances that could capture and maintain the attention of beings whose entertainment standards had been refined through exposure to infinite varieties of artistic expression across countless dimensions. The psychological pressure that Cromulon visitations created for developing civilizations was immense and transformative, forcing rapid cultural evolution as entire species faced the prospect of extinction if their artistic and entertainment capabilities proved insufficient to satisfy cosmic judges whose aesthetic preferences remained largely incomprehensible. To beings operating within normal space-time limitations, the knowledge that their continued existence depended on their ability to entertain entities whose consciousness operated on scales beyond planetary comprehension created existential crises that either destroyed civilizations completely or accelerated their development toward forms of cultural sophistication they might never have achieved through normal evolutionary processes. The concept of cosmic evaluation through entertainment reflected a universe where aesthetic achievement and creative innovation were treated as fundamental measures of a civilization's right to exist, creating moral and philosophical frameworks that prioritized artistic excellence over traditional measures of social progress like technological advancement, economic prosperity, or military power. This value system was simultaneously liberating and terrifying for civilizations that discovered their survival depended not on their ability to defend themselves or manage their resources effectively, but on their capacity to create performances that could capture the attention of cosmic entities, whose judgment criteria remained mysterious and apparently arbitrary. Other planet-sized entities that existed within the same general category as the Cromulons included the Worldender, whose consciousness was focused on destruction rather than evaluation, and various cosmic beings, whose purposes and motivations remained completely opaque to smaller-scale forms of consciousness that encountered them during their travels through interdimensional space. These entities shared the Cromulon's scale and apparent immortality, but differed significantly in their interactions with planetary civilizations, suggesting that transcendence to cosmic-scale consciousness did not necessarily result in similar attitudes towards smaller beings or consistent approaches to the exercise of their vast powers. The relationship between cosmic entities and planetary civilizations revealed fundamental questions about responsibility, power, and the nature of consciousness that had no satisfactory answers within conventional moral frameworks developed by beings whose existence was constrained by finite lifespans and limited capabilities. The casual way that cosmic beings could eliminate entire civilizations or transform the fundamental nature of reality in response to their aesthetic preferences or momentary whims created ethical paradoxes that challenged every assumption about justice, fairness, and the rights of conscious beings to continued existence. Musical and performance traditions across countless civilizations were permanently altered by the knowledge that cosmic entities might appear at any moment, demanding demonstrations of cultural achievement that would determine their species' survival. The pressure to maintain constant readiness for Cromulon-style evaluations led to the development of performance cultures where artistic excellence was treated as a form of planetary defense system, with entire educational and economic systems reorganized around the cultivation of creative talents that might prove crucial during cosmic judgment events. The psychological impact of living under the constant possibility of cosmic judgment created new forms of anxiety and cultural neurosis that manifested differently across species, depending on their basic psychological structures and social organizations. Some civilizations developed fatalistic acceptance of their cosmic insignificance and focused on creating art for its own sake, regardless of external evaluation, while others became obsessively focused on trying to understand and anticipate the aesthetic preferences of cosmic judges whose standards remained fundamentally alien and unpredictable. Rick's understanding of cosmic entities like the Cromulons was colored by his own transformation into something approaching cosmic-scale consciousness through his mastery of interdimensional travel and his accumulated knowledge across infinite realities. His ability to interact with the Cromulons as something closer to an equal, rather than a subject for evaluation, reflected his evolution beyond normal human limitations, but also highlighted the isolation and alienation that accompanied such transcendence of ordinary existence. The hierarchy of power among universe-spanning beings was complex and fluid, with different entities wielding influence over different aspects of cosmic reality, depending on their particular areas of interest and capability. The Cromulons' focus on entertainment and cultural evaluation placed them in conflict with entities whose purposes involved destruction, transformation, or other forms of cosmic intervention that could interfere with the civilizations they had chosen to preserve or eliminate based on their aesthetic judgments. The way cosmic entities viewed smaller civilizations was fundamentally shaped by their perspective on consciousness and identity, with some entities treating individual beings as completely insignificant compared to larger patterns of cultural and civilizational development, while others maintained interest in particular individuals whose achievements or characteristics caught their attention across the vast scales of space and time they naturally inhabited. The role of performance in interdimensional diplomacy became increasingly important as more civilizations developed awareness of cosmic entities and their tendency to evaluate planetary cultures through entertainment-based criteria. The development of universal performance standards and cross-cultural artistic traditions represented attempts to create forms of expression that could appeal to cosmic judges, regardless of their particular aesthetic preferences or cultural backgrounds. The philosophical implications of cosmic-scale consciousness raised fundamental questions about the nature of identity and responsibility that had no clear answers within the moral frameworks that smaller-scale beings used to organize their societies and relationships. The possibility that consciousness could evolve to scales where individual planets and civilizations became insignificant challenged every assumption about the meaning and purpose of existence that finite beings had developed to make their lives comprehensible and worthwhile. The impact of cosmic entities on the development of art and culture across the multiverse was profound and permanent, creating selection pressures that favored civilizations capable of producing entertainment that could satisfy judges whose consciousness operated beyond normal limitations of space, time, and individual identity. The knowledge that cosmic evaluation was possible and potentially imminent influenced artistic development in ways that might have accelerated creative evolution or might have distorted it away from authentic cultural expression toward forms designed primarily to impress incomprehensible cosmic judges. The technology that some civilizations developed in attempts to understand or communicate with cosmic entities revealed the limitations of conventional science when applied to forms of consciousness that transcended normal physical laws and spatial relationships. The failure of technological approaches to cosmic consciousness suggested that interaction with such entities required forms of understanding that were more artistic or intuitive than scientific, explaining why entertainment-based evaluation systems like those employed by the Cromulons might represent the most natural form of communication between cosmic and planetary scales of existence. The long-term evolutionary consequences of cosmic entity intervention in planetary development were impossible to predict or evaluate within normal timeframes, as the effects of such interventions might not become apparent until civilizations had developed far beyond their current limitations, or had been eliminated entirely through failure to satisfy cosmic judgment criteria. The uncertainty about whether cosmic evaluation represented beneficial acceleration of cultural development or arbitrary destruction of civilizations that might have achieved greatness through different evolutionary paths created ongoing debates among species sophisticated enough to understand the implications of their cosmic situation. As civilizations across the multiverse continued to develop under the shadow of possible cosmic judgment, they faced the fundamental challenge of maintaining authentic cultural development while preparing for evaluations whose criteria remained mysterious and whose consequences were absolute. The balance between genuine artistic achievement and performance designed to satisfy cosmic judges represented one of the most complex challenges facing any species that achieved awareness of the cosmic entities whose attention could mean either preservation or extinction, depending on their aesthetic judgments, and entertainment preferences. The Citadel of Rix represented far more than a simple governmental structure or defensive alliance. It was a complete ecosystem of interdimensional civilization built around the fundamental premise that Rick Sanchez was the most important form of consciousness in the multiverse, and that all other forms of life existed primarily to serve, support, or entertain the infinite variations of his genius across countless realities. The non-Rick species that inhabited this massive space station had evolved, been modified, or been recruited specifically to fulfill roles within a society where Rick-level intelligence was treated as the natural ruling class, and everything else was considered auxiliary to their needs and preferences. The economic foundation of Citadel society rested on the labor and services provided by dozens of alien species whose capabilities had been carefully matched to the specific requirements of maintaining a civilization designed around the pomp-en-serre, comfort and convenience of beings whose intelligence and technological capabilities far exceeded anything their original evolutionary environments had prepared them to handle. These species had developed symbiotic relationships with Rick variants that were simultaneously beneficial and exploitative, providing them with security and purpose, while also constraining their development within narrow parameters defined by their utility to Rick society. The Doofus Rick dimension had produced unique variations of familiar species that reflected the gentler, more cooperative nature of that reality's version of Rick Sanchez, creating alien civilizations that had evolved under the influence of Rick-level intelligence applied toward humanitarian rather than self-serving purposes. The species from this dimension displayed characteristics that suggested what alien development might look like when guided by scientific genius, combined with genuine concern for collective welfare rather than individual aggrandizement or the pursuit of power for its own sake. The Zygerians from Doofus Rick's reality had developed advanced simulation technologies, not for the purpose of exploitation or deception, but as tools for education and cultural preservation, creating virtual environments where different species could experience and understand each other's perspectives without the risks and complications that normally accompany direct contact between radically different forms of sane consciousness. Their approach to simulation technology demonstrated how the same basic scientific principles could be applied toward building, understanding, rather than manipulating or controlling other beings. The service species that had evolved specifically to cater to Rick needs represented perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Citadel society, as these beings had been either genetically modified or had naturally developed psychological and physiological characteristics that made them dependent on Rick approval and validation for their basic sense of purpose and identity. The Calaxian crystals that provided Rick with enhanced cognitive abilities were harvested by species whose entire civilization had been structured around the cultivation and refinement of these substances, creating economic relationships that were simultaneously voluntary and coercive. The social stratification within Citadel society was far more complex than the simple Rick versus everyone else hierarchy that casual observers might assume, with different alien species occupying distinct niches within the social and economic structure based on their particular capabilities and their historical relationships with various Rick factions. Some species held positions of significant influence and autonomy within their specialized domains, while others existed in conditions approaching slavery, despite the technological sophistication of their environment. The Glipglops, who managed waste disposal and environmental maintenance systems throughout the Citadel, had developed a culture that found profound meaning and satisfaction in maintaining the cleanliness and functionality of the space station, but their cultural values had been so thoroughly shaped by generations of service to Rick society that it was impossible to determine whether their contentment represented genuine fulfillment or sophisticated psychological conditioning, designed to ensure their continued cooperation with systems that exploited their labor. Species that had evolved specifically to interact with Rick-level intelligence displayed cognitive capabilities that were highly specialized rather than generally applicable, making them extraordinarily effective at understanding and anticipating Rick needs while leaving them poorly equipped to function independently or develop their own civilizations beyond the context of service to Rick society. These beings represented evolutionary adaptations to artificial selection pressures created by Rick influence rather than natural development in response to environmental challenges. The Mortys from various dimensions brought with them the unique species characteristics of their home realities, creating a diverse population of humanity variants whose interactions with each other and with Citadel alien species provided insights into how human development might proceed under different cosmic conditions and influences. The simple Rick Dimensions version of humanity had retained childlike wonder and optimism, despite exposure to interdimensional travel, while other human variants had developed psychological characteristics that made them more or less compatible with Rick society. The destruction of the Citadel had profound and varied impacts on the dependent civilizations that had structured their entire existence around the assumption that Rick society would continue to provide stability, resources, and direction for their development. Some species adapted to independence more successfully than others, with their success largely dependent on whether their relationship with Rick society had been primarily economic, cultural, or psychological in nature. The Zygerian refugees who had depended on Citadel protection from more aggressive species found themselves vulnerable to predation and exploitation by civilizations that had viewed the Citadel as a threat to their own expansion and development. Their simulation technologies, which had been valuable assets within Citadel society, became targets for theft and appropriation by species who lacked the ethical frameworks that had governed their use within Rick-controlled space. Cross-dimensional species migration patterns were dramatically altered by the Citadel's collapse, as beings who had become accustomed to free movement between Rick-controlled dimensions suddenly found themselves stranded in realities where their presence was unwelcome or where they lacked the technological infrastructure necessary for survival. The refugee crisis that followed the Citadel's destruction affected millions of beings across hundreds of dimensions, creating humanitarian emergencies that no remaining government or organization was equipped to address adequately. The black market economy that had operated in the shadows of official Citadel commerce expanded dramatically in the aftermath of the government's collapse, providing essential services and resources to displaced populations while also enabling exploitation and abuse that the Citadel's law enforcement systems had previously prevented or minimized. Species trafficking became a significant problem as beings with valuable capabilities found themselves vulnerable to capture and forced labor in dimensions where they had no legal protections or social connections. The reconstruction efforts that emerged from the ruins of Citadel society were hampered by fundamental disagreements about whether the new civilization should attempt to recreate the Rick-dominated structure that had provided stability and prosperity, or should develop alternative forms of social organization that distributed power more equitably among different species and intelligence levels. These debates reflected deeper philosophical questions about the relationship between intelligence, authority, and moral responsibility that had been suppressed during the period of Rick dominance. Some alien species chose to establish independent colonies in dimensions far from any Rick presence, seeking to develop their civilizations without the influence or interference of beings whose capabilities made traditional concepts of sovereignty and self-determination largely meaningless. These experimental communities represented attempts to discover what their cultures might have become if they had never encountered Rick-level intelligence, or if such encounters had occurred under conditions of mutual respect rather than hierarchical domination. The species rehabilitation programs that were established in some dimensions focused on helping beings who had become psychologically dependent on Rick society develop the independence and self-reliance necessary for autonomous existence. These programs faced the complex challenge of distinguishing between genuine cultural characteristics and traits that had been artificially induced through exposure to Rick influence, requiring careful analysis of each species' natural development patterns and potential for growth beyond their current limitations. The technological dependencies that many species had developed during their time within Citadel society created ongoing challenges for their transition to independence, as they lacked the knowledge and infrastructure necessary to maintain or develop the advanced systems they had become accustomed to using. The gradual loss of Rick-provided technology forced many communities to rediscover older techniques and approaches that had been abandoned during their period of technological dependence. The cultural exchange programs that had flourished within the diverse environment of the Citadel were among the casualties of its destruction, as species that had learned to appreciate and understand each other's perspectives found themselves isolated within their own communities and unable to maintain the relationships that had enriched their development during the period of Rick governance. The loss of these connections impoverished the cultural life of many species and eliminated opportunities for continued growth through exposure to alien perspectives and ideas. The memory of Citadel society continued to influence the development of post-collapse communities in ways both positive and negative, serving as either a model for what effective interspecies cooperation could achieve, or as a cautionary example of the dangers inherent in accepting the dominance of any single form of consciousness, regardless of its apparent superiority in intelligence or technological capability. The planet Gazorp represented one of the most extreme examples of gender-based societal division that existed anywhere in the known multiverse, creating a civilization where the fundamental differences between male and female members of the species had evolved into completely separate cultures with opposing values, technologies, and approaches to existence that made meaningful communication between the sexes nearly impossible despite their biological interdependence for reproduction and species survival. The male Gazorpians inhabited a post-apocalyptic wasteland that reflected their evolution toward violence, aggression, and immediate gratification as primary cultural values, living in primitive conditions despite having access to advanced technology that they used exclusively for warfare, destruction, and the pursuit of dominance over their environment and each other. Their society was organized around principles of physical strength, territorial control, and the glorification of violence as the ultimate expression of masculine identity and worth. The psychological development of male Gazorpians was arrested at what most species would consider adolescent levels of emotional maturity, with their entire culture structured around the satisfaction of immediate desires without consideration for long-term consequences or the welfare of others. Their language consisted primarily of grunts, threats, and expressions of violent intent, suggesting that their cognitive development had been shaped by evolutionary pressures that rewarded aggression and dominance, while eliminating traits associated with cooperation, planning, or empathy. The underground civilization of female Gazorpians had evolved along completely different trajectories, developing advanced technologies, sophisticated philosophical systems, and complex social structures that emphasized intellectual achievement, artistic expression, and collective welfare over individual power or dominance. Their cities were marvels of engineering and aesthetic design that demonstrated capabilities far exceeding anything the male population had achieved during their focus on warfare and destruction. The technological achievements of female Gazorpazorpian society included advanced genetic engineering, sophisticated computer systems, and weapons technologies that were used primarily for defense against male incursions, rather than for aggressive expansion or conquest of other civilizations. Their approach to scientific development was characterized by careful consideration of ethical implications and long-term consequences, creating innovations that enhanced quality of life, rather than simply increasing destructive capability. The reproductive system that connected these two radically different populations was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Gazorpazorpian biology, as it required periodic interaction between groups whose cultural values and basic approaches to existence had diverged so completely that meaningful communication or mutual understanding seemed impossible. The females had developed technologies for managing reproduction that minimized their exposure to male violence while ensuring species survival, but the system remained inherently exploitative and psychologically traumatic for both populations. Summer Smith's experience with Gazorpazorpian feminism provided insights into how human perspectives on gender equality compared to alien approaches to similar problems, revealing both the universality of certain gender-related conflicts and the specific cultural contexts that shaped how different species approached questions of power, identity, and social organization. Her initial enthusiasm for the female Gazorpazorpian society was tempered by growing recognition that their solutions to gender-based oppression had created new forms of inequality and exclusion that were no less problematic than the systems they had replaced. The Gazorpazorpian approach to feminism was complicated by their biological and cultural history in ways that made direct comparison to human gender politics impossible, as their extreme sexual dimorphism and evolutionary development had created conditions where cooperation between genders was genuinely difficult, rather than simply prevented by artificial social barriers. The female society's exclusion of males was not merely political but reflected genuine incompatibilities in cognitive development, communication abilities, and basic value systems that had emerged through centuries of divergent evolution. Other species throughout the multiverse had developed their own unique approaches to gender-based social organization that reflected their particular biological characteristics and evolutionary histories, creating a spectrum of gender relationships that ranged from complete integration to total separation, depending on how sexual reproduction and social cooperation had evolved within specific environmental contexts. Some species had eliminated gender distinctions entirely through technological or biological means, while others had developed multiple gender categories that served different social and reproductive functions. The squanch species had evolved a fluid approach to gender identity that allowed individuals to change their biological and social characteristics in response to environmental conditions or personal preferences, creating a society where gender roles were temporary and contextual, rather than fixed biological categories. Their approach to reproduction involved complex negotiations between multiple individuals whose gender expressions could shift during the course of their relationships, requiring sophisticated social protocols for managing family structures and child-rearing responsibilities. The Cromulons, as cosmic-scale entities, had transcended conventional concepts of gender entirely, existing as forms of consciousness that incorporated characteristics from multiple biological traditions while maintaining coherent individual identities that were not constrained by the reproductive requirements or social conventions that shaped gender roles in smaller scale civilizations. Their perspective on gender-based conflicts among planetary species was one of amused detachment, viewing such struggles as temporary phases in the development of consciousness toward more sophisticated forms of identity and social organization. Environmental factors had played crucial roles in shaping gender dynamics across different species, with planets that experienced regular catastrophic events often developing gender systems that emphasized differentiated survival strategies, while more stable environments tended to produce species with more integrated gender roles and cooperative reproductive strategies. The extreme conditions on Gazorpazorp, including resource scarcity and environmental toxicity, had created selection pressures that rewarded aggressive competition among males while encouraging females to develop defensive technologies and underground civilizations. The role of advanced technology in reshaping traditional gender relationships varied significantly across species, depending on their cultural values and historical experiences with gender-based conflict. Some civilizations used technology to eliminate biological differences between genders, while others employed it to enhance and amplify existing distinctions in ways that made cooperation more difficult rather than easier. The Gazorpazorpian females' use of technology to isolate themselves from male society represented one extreme approach to managing gender conflicts through technological means. Interspecies relationships between beings from civilizations with radically different approaches to gender created complex diplomatic and cultural challenges that required careful navigation of assumptions and expectations that might not translate across biological and social boundaries. The attempts by some species to establish romantic or reproductive relationships with beings whose gender concepts were fundamentally incompatible often resulted in misunderstandings and conflicts that reflected broader problems in cross-species communication and cultural exchange. Rick Sanchez's observations on species-wide gender conflicts reflected his typical combination of scientific detachment and personal cynicism, viewing such struggles as inevitable consequences of biological evolution rather than problems that could be solved through social engineering or technological intervention. His interactions with Gazorpazorpian society demonstrated his ability to navigate complex gender dynamics when necessary, while maintaining his characteristic indifference to the moral and political implications of the systems he encountered. The impact of Rick's presence on gender-based civilizations was typically disruptive rather than constructive, as his technological capabilities and interdimensional perspective made him largely immune to the social constraints and cultural expectations that govern gender relationships within individual species. His casual disregard for local gender customs often created conflicts that revealed the artificial nature of many gender-based restrictions, while also undermining the social stability that such systems provided for their participants. The comparative analysis of matriarchal versus patriarchal alien societies revealed that neither system necessarily produced better outcomes for individual welfare or social development, as both approaches to gender-based power distribution could be implemented in ways that were either oppressive or liberating, depending on the specific cultural values and institutional structures that supported them. The key factor in determining the success of any gender-based social system was not which gender held formal authority, but whether the system provided opportunities for all individuals to develop their capabilities and contribute to collective welfare. The long-term evolutionary implications of extreme gender-based social division remained unclear for species like the Gazorpazorpians, as their current reproductive system was both biologically unsustainable and culturally destructive in ways that suggested either dramatic social change or eventual species extinction. The possibility that their gender conflict might resolve through technological transcendence of biological limitations or through catastrophic social collapse, represented the two most likely outcomes for civilizations that had developed such extreme forms of sexual segregation and cultural opposition between their reproductive populations. The Purge planet represented one of the most psychologically disturbing examples of ritualized violence that Rick and Morty encountered during their interdimensional travels. A world where an entire civilization had evolved social structures, cultural traditions, and economic systems around the premise that periodic episodes of unrestrained brutality were not only acceptable, but necessary for maintaining psychological health and social stability within their population. The annual Purge tradition on this world was far more than simple cathartic release of violent impulses. It represented a complex cultural institution that had been refined over centuries of social development into a sophisticated system for managing aggression, social hierarchy, and psychological pressure that built up within their civilization during periods of enforced cooperation and peaceful coexistence. The ritual served multiple functions simultaneously, providing entertainment, population control, social mobility, and collective emotional release through carefully orchestrated chaos that appeared random but actually followed elaborate cultural protocols and unspoken rules. The species that inhabited Purge Planet had evolved psychological characteristics that made them naturally prone to violent behavior under stress, but their intelligence and social development had enabled them to channel these tendencies into culturally productive rather than destructively chaotic directions. Their approach to managing inherent aggression through ritualized violence represented a sophisticated understanding of their own psychology that was both deeply disturbing and remarkably effective at maintaining long-term social stability. The cultural significance of the Purge extended far beyond the actual period of violence to encompass elaborate preparation rituals, complex systems of alliance and betrayal, and extensive post-purge ceremonies that processed the psychological and social consequences of the violence that had occurred. The entire annual cycle of their civilization revolved around the Purge, with economic activity, social relationships, and individual life planning all organized around the assumption that periodic violence was an inevitable and necessary aspect of their existence. The psychological preparation that individuals underwent before each purge was as elaborate and culturally significant as the violence itself, involving meditation practices, physical conditioning, and mental exercises designed to maximize their effectiveness during the period of unrestrained aggression, while also preparing them to return to peaceful cooperation once the purge period ended. The ability to transition smoothly between violent and peaceful behavior was considered a mark of cultural sophistication and personal development within their society. Morty and Rick's intervention in Purge Planet society during one of their visits had profound and lasting consequences that revealed the fragility of social systems built around carefully balanced cycles of violence and cooperation. Rick's casual disregard for the cultural protocols that govern purge behavior, and Morty's emotional response to the violence around him, disrupted patterns that had been maintained for generations, creating chaos that extended far beyond the normal boundaries of purge activity. The aftermath of Rick and Morty's involvement demonstrated how external intervention could destabilize social systems that appeared barbaric to outsiders, but actually served important functions within the specific cultural and psychological context of the species that had developed them. The collapse of traditional purge protocols led to ongoing violence that was far more destructive than the ritualized aggression it replaced, revealing the sophisticated social engineering that had made the original system sustainable despite its apparent brutality. Other species throughout the multiverse had developed their own approaches to ritualized violence as a cultural foundation, with variations that reflected different evolutionary pressures, environmental challenges, and psychological characteristics that shaped how aggression could be channeled into socially productive rather than destructively chaotic directions. Some species had developed elaborate tournament systems where violence was contained within specific contexts and governed by complex rules, while others had created artistic traditions that transformed aggressive impulses into creative expression. The Gazorpazorpian males represented an extreme example of a species where ritualized violence had become the entire basis of cultural identity rather than simply one aspect of a more complex social system. Their constant warfare and aggression served no apparent constructive purpose beyond the immediate satisfaction of violent impulses, creating a society that was both more primitive and less psychologically sophisticated than Purge Planet's carefully managed approach to collective aggression. The psychology of species-wide cathartic violence revealed fundamental questions about the relationship between individual psychological health and collective social stability that had no clear answers within conventional frameworks for understanding morality and social organization. The apparent effectiveness of ritualized violence as a tool for managing psychological pressure and social tension challenged assumptions about the inherently destructive nature of aggression, while raising disturbing questions about the predation, moral implications of societies that institutionalized brutality as a solution to psychological and social problems. The economic systems that supported purge-like traditions were remarkably sophisticated, requiring careful management of resources, population levels, and social infrastructure to ensure that periodic episodes of destruction did not compromise the long-term viability of the civilization. The planning and coordination necessary to maintain societies where ritualized violence was a regular occurrence demonstrated levels of social organization and collective thinking that seemed incompatible with the apparent barbarism of the, quote, practices they supported. How peaceful species interacted with violent civilizations presented complex diplomatic and ethical challenges that revealed the limitations of universal moral principles when applied to beings whose psychological and cultural development had occurred under radically different conditions. The tendency of peaceful species to view ritualized violence as evidence of primitive development or moral failure often prevented them from understanding the sophisticated social engineering that made such systems effective for the species that had evolved them. The role of violence in alien population control mechanisms extended beyond simple elimination of excess individuals to encompass complex social processes that determined which members of the population would survive and reproduce based on their performance during periods of ritualized aggression. These selection pressures created evolutionary dynamics that were simultaneously disturbing and remarkably effective at maintaining genetic and cultural characteristics that enabled the species to continue functioning within their chosen social framework. Rick's fascination with and participation in violent alien cultures reflected his own psychological development toward casual acceptance of brutality as a tool for solving problems and achieving objectives. His ability to engage with species like those on Purge Planet without moral qualms or emotional disturbance demonstrated how completely his years of interdimensional travel had severed his connection to conventional human ethical frameworks and emotional responses to violence. The entertainment value that Rick derived from observing and participating in alien violence revealed the extent to which his own psychology had been corrupted by exposure to infinite realities where every possible form of behavior existed somewhere as normal and accepted practice. His treatment of other beings' suffering as amusing spectacle reflected a form of moral development that was perhaps more disturbing than the ritualized violence of species who at least maintained cultural frameworks that gave meaning and purpose to their aggression. The aftermath and long-term consequences of cultural violence extended far beyond the immediate physical damage to encompass psychological trauma, social disruption, and cultural changes that could persist for generations after specific episodes of ritualized aggression had ended. The species that practiced such traditions had developed sophisticated methods for processing and integrating the psychological impact of violence, but these coping mechanisms were often fragile and could be disrupted by external intervention or internal social changes. Species that had evolved beyond their violent origins provided examples of how civilizations could transition away from ritualized aggression toward more peaceful approaches to managing psychological pressure and social tension. These evolutionary success stories demonstrated that violence-based cultural systems were not necessarily permanent or inevitable, but the transition process was often lengthy, difficult, and marked by significant social upheaval and cultural loss. The diplomatic challenges involved in dealing with inherently violent species required the development of specialized protocols and communication strategies that could accommodate beings whose cultural norms included regular episodes of ritualized brutality. The failure to understand and respect these cultural differences often led to conflicts that were far more destructive than the original violence they were intended to prevent or modify. The long-term sustainability of violence-based civilizations remained questionable, as the psychological and social costs of maintaining such systems often increased over time, while their benefits became less apparent to populations that developed alternative approaches to managing aggression and social pressure. The challenge for violent species was finding ways to evolve beyond their dependence on ritualized brutality without losing the social cohesion and cultural identity that such practices had historically provided. The moral implications of external intervention in violent alien cultures raised fundamental questions about the rights of species to maintain cultural practices that appeared harmful or primitive to outside observers, but served important functions within their specific social and psychological contexts. The balance between respecting cultural autonomy and protecting individual welfare from harmful practices had no clear resolution when applied to species whose entire civilizations were built around assumptions about violence and aggression that conflicted with universal principles of individual rights and collective welfare. Unity represented perhaps the most complex and philosophically challenging form of consciousness that Rick Sanchez had ever encountered in his extensive travels through infinite realities. Existing as a collective intelligence that transcended individual identity while maintaining coherent personality, characteristics, and emotional capabilities that made meaningful relationships with singular beings not only possible but profoundly intimate in ways that conventional, individual-to-individual connections could never achieve. The nature of unity as a collective consciousness entity defied every assumption about identity, autonomy, and individual rights that most species had developed through their evolution as discrete beings with separate minds and independent decision-making capabilities. Unity's ability to simultaneously inhabit and control multiple bodies while maintaining a unified sense of self created a form of existence where the boundaries between individual and collective, self and other, personal desire and communal need became fluid categories subject to conscious manipulation rather than fixed biological or psychological limitations. The process through which unity assimilated different species into its collective consciousness was remarkably sophisticated and adaptable, capable of integrating beings with radically different cognitive structures, sensory capabilities, and cultural backgrounds into a unified whole that preserved useful characteristics while eliminating sources of conflict and inefficiency that typically plagued multi-species civilizations. The voluntary nature of Unity's assimilation process made it fundamentally different from parasitic or invasive forms of consciousness control, as beings who joined Unity experienced genuine improvements in their quality of life and psychological well-being while retaining access to their memories and personal histories. The philosophical implications of Unity's existence raised profound questions about the value of individual consciousness and the possibility that collective forms of mental organization might represent evolutionary advancement, rather than loss of human dignity and autonomy. The beings who had been assimilated by Unity displayed higher levels of cooperation, reduced anxiety and interpersonal conflict, and increased efficiency in pursuing both personal and collective goals, suggesting that individual consciousness might be a transitional phase rather than the ultimate expression of mental development. Unity's relationship with Rick provided insights into both entities' psychological needs and developmental trajectories, revealing how beings who had transcended normal limitations through different paths might find connection and understanding that was impossible with others who remained constrained by conventional individual identity and moral frameworks. Their romantic relationship was complicated by fundamental differences in how they experienced existence and relationships, but it also demonstrated genuine emotional compatibility that transcended their radically different approaches to consciousness and identity. Other collective consciousness species throughout the multiverse had evolved along different trajectories that reflected various solutions to the problems of individual versus group identity, with some maintaining strict hierarchical structures where individual minds retained distinct roles within the collective, while others achieved complete integration where individual identity became merely historical information rather than ongoing psychological reality. The diversity of approaches to collective consciousness suggested that Unity's particular form of mental organization was not inevitable, but represented specific choices about how to balance efficiency, creativity, and individual fulfillment within group structures. The Borg-like species that Rick had encountered in various dimensions represented more aggressive and less sophisticated approaches to collective consciousness, using technological rather than biological integration to create unified civilizations that prioritized efficiency over individual welfare or psychological health. These mechanistic approaches to collective consciousness often produced powerful and technologically advanced civilizations, but failed to achieve the psychological satisfaction and creative innovation that Unity's more organic integration process enabled. The relationship between individuality and collective efficiency represented one of the fundamental trade-offs that species faced when considering various forms of social organization, with pure individualism maximizing personal autonomy at the cost of coordination and cooperation, while complete collective integration achieved unprecedented levels of social harmony at the potential expense of creativity and individual fulfillment. Unity's approach appeared to optimize this balance more successfully than most species had managed, but the long-term consequences of collective consciousness remained unclear. The hybrid individual-collective entities that existed in some dimensions demonstrated intermediate approaches to the problem of balancing personal identity with group cohesion, maintaining distinct individual minds that could temporarily merge for specific purposes, while retaining the ability to separate and pursue independent goals when collective action was unnecessary. These flexible approaches to consciousness suggested that the choice between individual and collective identity might be a false dichotomy, with various forms of partial integration offering alternative solutions. Rick's complex romantic relationship with Unity was characterized by genuine emotional connection that coexisted with fundamental incompatibilities in their approaches to existence and relationships. His need for individual autonomy and control conflicted with Unity's natural tendency toward integration and collective decision-making, creating tensions that neither entity could resolve through compromise or accommodation without fundamentally altering their essential nature and psychological needs. The psychological benefits that Unity provided to its constituent beings included elimination of loneliness, reduction of interpersonal conflict, and access to collective knowledge and capabilities that far exceeded what individual minds could achieve through cooperation alone. The beings within Unity's collective experienced a form of psychological security and social connection that individual consciousness could rarely provide, suggesting that many of the problems that plagued individual-based civilizations might be artifacts of mental organization, rather than inevitable aspects of conscious existence. Species that existed as hybrid individual collective entities had developed sophisticated protocols for managing the transition between individual and collective modes of consciousness, creating cultural traditions and technological systems that enabled beings to experience both forms of mental organization depending on their current needs and circumstances. These flexible approaches to consciousness suggested that the apparent conflict between individual and collective identity might be resolved through temporal, rather than permanent solutions. How hive minds interacted with strongly individualistic species presented complex diplomatic and cultural challenges that often resulted in mutual incomprehension rather than meaningful communication or cooperation. The fundamental differences in how collective and individual consciousness entities approached concepts like personal responsibility, individual rights, and social organization made translation between their perspectives extremely difficult and often impossible without significant cultural accommodation from both parties. The benefits of collective consciousness for civilizations included unprecedented levels of coordination and cooperation, elimination of many forms of social conflict and inequality, and access to collective intelligence capabilities that enabled solutions to problems that individual-based societies could not address effectively. The efficiency gains from collective consciousness often enabled such civilizations to achieve technological and social advances that were impossible for species that remained limited by individual cognitive capabilities and social coordination challenges. The costs of collective consciousness included potential loss of individual creativity and innovation, reduced psychological diversity within the population, and vulnerability to collective decision-making errors that could affect entire civilizations simultaneously. The trade-offs involved in collective consciousness were complex and species-specific, with different forms of mental organization, offering different advantages and disadvantages depending on environmental challenges and cultural values. Resistance movements within assimilated populations were rare but not unknown, typically occurring when Unity's integration process encountered beings whose psychological structure or cultural background made collective consciousness genuinely incompatible with their mental health or personal development. Unity's approach to such resistance was typically accommodating rather than coercive, allowing incompatible beings to leave the collective or exist within it in modified forms that preserved their individual identity, while minimizing disruption to collective functioning. The evolution of hive mind species and their expansion patterns revealed sophisticated strategies for growth and development that balanced the benefits of increased collective intelligence with the challenges of maintaining coherent identity across ever larger populations and geographical areas. Unity's approach to expansion was careful and gradual, focusing on quality of integration rather than simple numerical growth, suggesting a level of long-term planning and self-awareness that exceeded most individual-based civilizations. Unity's long-term goals and vision for universal assimilation represented both utopian aspiration and potential threat to the diversity of consciousness forms that existed throughout the multiverse. The possibility that Unity might eventually encompass all conscious beings within its collective raised profound questions about the value of mental diversity and the rights of species to maintain individual consciousness, even if collective alternatives offered superior quality of life and social harmony. The philosophical debate about whether Unity's expansion represented benevolent improvement of existence or subtle form of consciousness genocide had no clear resolution within conventional moral frameworks, as the voluntary nature of Unity's integration process and the genuine benefits it provided to assimilated beings complicated simple assessments of its activities as helpful or harmful to universal welfare and the preservation of conscious diversity. The relationship between Unity and Rick ultimately ended, not because of lack of affection, but because of fundamental incompatibilities in their approaches to existence that could not be resolved through emotional connection alone, demonstrating that even the most profound forms of love and understanding could not bridge certain gaps in psychological structure and basic needs for autonomy versus integration. The microverse that Rick constructed within his car's battery represented one of the most morally complex achievements in his extensive catalogue of scientific innovations, creating an entire universe populated by intelligent beings whose existence served no purpose beyond generating electrical power for Rick's convenience, while remaining completely unaware that their reality was artificially created and maintained solely for utilitarian exploitation by entities whose existence they could never comprehend or meaningfully influence. The civilization that developed within Rick's battery universe had evolved naturally from the basic physical laws and environmental conditions that Rick had programmed into their reality, achieving levels of technological sophistication and cultural development that demonstrated the remarkable creativity and adaptability of conscious beings, even when their fundamental circumstances were artificially constrained and manipulated by forces beyond their understanding or control. Their scientific achievements, artistic traditions, and social institutions were genuine expressions of intelligence and creativity, despite the artificial nature of their cosmic environment. The ethics of creating universes for utilitarian purposes raised profound questions about the responsibilities that creators bore toward the conscious beings whose existence they had made possible, particularly when those beings were capable of suffering, growth, and meaningful relationships, but were denied any opportunity to understand or influence the conditions that determine their ultimate fate and purpose within the larger cosmic structure that contained their reality. Zeep Zandflorp emerged as perhaps the most tragic figure within the microverse hierarchy, a brilliant scientist whose intelligence and creativity enabled him to duplicate Rick's achievement by creating his own sub-universe populated by conscious beings whose labor could be exploited to generate power for his civilization's needs. Zeep's discovery that his own universe was artificially created for exploitation created an existential crisis that paralleled Rick's own psychological development, forcing him to confront the moral implications of his scientific achievements, while simultaneously recognizing his complete powerlessness to change his fundamental circumstances. The miniverse that Zeep created within Rick's microverse demonstrated the recursive nature of exploitation that could emerge when intelligent beings discovered the techniques for universe creation without developing corresponding moral frameworks for understanding their responsibilities toward the conscious entities whose existence they made possible. Zeep's rationalization of his own universe creation as necessary for his civilization's survival and development exactly paralleled Rick's justifications for the original microverse, revealing how easily moral compromise could spread through hierarchies of power and knowledge. The psychological impact on beings who discovered that their universe existed solely to serve the utilitarian needs of incomprehensibly powerful creators was devastating and transformative, forcing rapid evolution of philosophical and religious frameworks that could accommodate the reality of cosmic insignificance, while maintaining sufficient meaning and purpose to prevent civilizational collapse or mass psychological breakdown among populations whose fundamental assumptions about existence had been revealed as naive and incorrect. Multiple layers of nested realities created within each universe established chains of exploitation that extended downward through levels of decreasing scale, while maintaining consistent patterns of utilitarian manipulation and moral rationalization at each level. The beings within Kyle's universe, created by the scientist within Zeep's miniverse, remained unaware of their position within a hierarchy of exploitation that extended upward through multiple levels of reality toward Rick's dimension, demonstrating how easily systems of oppression could be maintained through ignorance and compartmentalization of knowledge. The information flow between universe levels was carefully controlled by the creators at each level to prevent lower-level civilizations from discovering their true circumstances and potentially developing technologies or philosophical frameworks that might threaten the stability of the exploitation systems that sustained the hierarchical structure. The suppression of certain forms of scientific inquiry and the manipulation of natural laws within created universes served to maintain the power differentials that made continued exploitation possible. The responsibility of creators toward their created civilizations was a question that Rick approached with characteristic cynicism and moral flexibility, treating the conscious beings within his microverse as sophisticated biological machines whose apparent sentience and capacity for suffering were irrelevant compared to their utility as power sources for his technological needs. His casual dismissal of their moral status reflected his broader evolution toward treating all conscious beings as resources to be managed rather than entities deserving of consideration and respect. The concept of slavery on a universal scale represented perhaps the most extreme form of exploitation that conscious beings had ever devised, transcending traditional concepts of individual or group oppression to encompass entire realities where every conscious entity existed solely to serve purposes determined by beings whose power and knowledge rendered resistance or negotiation completely impossible. The moral implications of universe-level slavery challenged every ethical framework that had been developed by civilizations operating within single realities. Species adaptation within artificially constrained environments revealed the remarkable flexibility and creativity of conscious beings when faced with limitations that were absolute and inescapable, but not immediately apparent as a harm. Artificial restrictions. The civilizations within Rick's nested universes developed technologies, cultures, and social institutions that were perfectly adapted to their circumstances, while remaining completely unaware that those circumstances had been deliberately designed to channel their development towards specific outcomes that served their creators' utilitarian purposes. The discovery of their universe's true nature and purpose typically triggered profound philosophical and religious crises within created civilizations, as they struggled to maintain meaning and purpose in existence while acknowledging their complete lack of autonomy or influence over their fundamental circumstances. Some civilizations responded to such revelations with acceptance and accommodation, while others developed resistance movements or nihilistic philosophies that threatened their continued viability as power sources. Rick's justifications for universe-scale exploitation relied primarily on arguments about the relative insignificance of suffering that occurred at scales smaller than his own reality and the utilitarian benefits that his technological achievements provided to beings within his own dimensional context. His ability to rationalize the oppression of entire universes demonstrated the sophisticated psychological mechanisms that highly intelligent beings could develop to avoid confronting the moral implications of their actions when those actions served their immediate practical needs. The long-term sustainability of nested universe systems remained questionable, as the psychological and social instabilities created by the artificial constraints and hidden purposes built into created realities often led to civilizational collapse or rebellion that eliminated their utility as power sources. The maintenance of stable exploitation required constant monitoring and occasional intervention to prevent the development of knowledge or technologies that might threaten the carefully maintained ignorance that made continued oppression possible. The philosophical questions raised by the existence of created universes extended beyond immediate moral concerns about exploitation to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of reality, consciousness, and meaning that had profound implications for how beings understood their own existence and moral responsibilities. The possibility that any given reality might be artificially created for purposes unknown to its inhabitants created epistemic uncertainty that could undermine the foundations of knowledge and moral reasoning within any civilization sophisticated enough to consider such possibilities. The relationship between power and moral responsibility became increasingly complex as the scale of creative capability increased, with universe creators possessing abilities that rendered traditional concepts of accountability and justice largely meaningless, while the scope of potential harm from their decisions affected numbers of conscious beings that exceeded any reasonable capacity for moral consideration or empathetic engagement. The recursive nature of universe creation suggested that Rick himself might exist within a created reality whose true purpose remained hidden from him by beings whose power and knowledge exceeded his own, creating the possibility that his exploitation of the microverse was itself part of a larger system of nested exploitation, extending upward through levels of reality that he could not perceive or influence, making him simultaneously oppressor and victim within cosmic hierarchies of power and utilitarian manipulation. The phenomenon of interdimensional cable represented one of the most fascinating and disturbing glimpses into the infinite creativity and bizarre evolutionary paths that consciousness had taken across the boundless expanse of realities, accessible through Rick's portal technology, revealing forms of entertainment, culture, and social organization that challenged every assumption about the relationship between intelligence, creativity, and the fundamental nature of existence itself. The infinite variety of species observed through interdimensional television broadcasts demonstrated the remarkable diversity of solutions that evolution had discovered for the basic problems of consciousness, survival, and social organization, with each reality producing unique combinations of biological characteristics, environmental pressures, and cultural development that resulted in forms of life so alien and unexpected that they defied categorization within any conventional framework for understanding intelligence or civilization. The evolutionary paths that led to the development of species whose entire existence revolved around entertainment production revealed environmental and social pressures that were fundamentally different from those that shaped most civilizations, suggesting realities where survival and reproduction were either so easily achieved or so impossible to influence that conscious beings had evolved to channel their intelligence and creativity primarily into artistic expression and performance rather than technological advancement or territorial expansion. The role of entertainment in alien cultural development extended far beyond simple recreation or artistic expression to encompass fundamental aspects of social organization, economic systems, and even biological reproduction, with some species having evolved psychological and physiological characteristics that made entertainment production necessary for their mental health, social cohesion, and continued survival as coherent civilizations. The Gazorpian dating show that Rick and Morty encountered during one of their interdimensional cable viewing sessions revealed a species where reproductive behavior had become so thoroughly integrated with entertainment production that the distinction between authentic courtship and performance had been eliminated entirely, creating a culture where romantic relationships existed primarily as content for broadcast consumption rather than genuine emotional connections between individuals. Species with naturally occurring broadcast capabilities had evolved biological structures that enabled them to transmit their thoughts, experiences, and creative works directly into the electromagnetic spectrum, creating forms of communication and artistic expression that transcended the limitations of conventional media technology, while also making privacy and individual autonomy nearly impossible within their social structures. The Ballfondler's universe represented perhaps the most extreme example of a reality where entertainment had become the primary organizing principle of civilization, with entire species dedicating their technological capabilities and social institutions to the production of increasingly elaborate and violent spectacles designed to satisfy the entertainment preferences of audiences whose attention spans and tolerance for conventional stimulation had been exhausted through exposure to infinite varieties of dramatic content. How interdimensional media influenced cross-species understanding was complicated by the fact that most species lacked the technological infrastructure or cultural frameworks necessary for accessing or interpreting entertainment produced by radically different forms of consciousness, creating information barriers that prevented meaningful cultural exchange, despite the theoretical availability of infinite varieties of artistic and intellectual content. The economics of interdimensional entertainment production revealed sophisticated market systems that operated across dimensional boundaries, with content creators from some realities developing the ability to broadcast their work into multiple dimensions simultaneously, while receiving compensation through complex systems of interdimensional currency exchange and audience measurement that transcended normal concepts of copyright, intellectual property, and creative ownership. Species that existed primarily as entertainment for others had evolved or been artificially created to fulfill specific roles within interdimensional broadcast systems, raising profound questions about autonomy, exploitation, and the moral implications of civilizations that treated other conscious beings primarily as sources of content for audience consumption rather than as entities deserving of consideration and respect in their own right. The psychological impact of infinite reality shows on viewers created new forms of addiction and mental illness that were specific to beings with access to interdimensional cable systems, as exposure to unlimited varieties of entertainment, content, overwhelmed normal psychological mechanisms for processing novelty and created dependency relationships that were more intense and destructive than any substance-based addiction that conventional civilizations had encountered. The ants in my eyes Johnson dimension demonstrated how physical disabilities or unusual biological characteristics could become the foundation for entire entertainment industries when combined with interdimensional broadcasting capabilities, suggesting that perceived limitations or abnormalities within one reality might represent valuable entertainment resources when viewed from the perspective of audiences with different aesthetic preferences and cultural backgrounds. How advertising and consumer culture varied across species revealed fundamental differences in how different forms of consciousness approached concepts like desire, satisfaction, and the relationship between individual needs and collective resource allocation, with some species having evolved psychological characteristics that made them completely immune to traditional advertising techniques, while others were so susceptible to marketing manipulation that their entire civilizations had been restructured around consumption patterns determined by interdimensional commercial interests. The plumbous manufacturing process, as depicted in interdimensional advertisements, represented a form of industrial organization that was simultaneously completely incomprehensible to human observers and perfectly logical within the cultural and technological context of the species that had developed it, demonstrating how basic concepts like utility, efficiency, and product design could take radically different forms depending on the evolutionary pressures and environmental conditions that shaped technological development. Rick's relationship with interdimensional media consumption reflected his characteristic combination of intellectual curiosity and emotional detachment, using exposure to infinite varieties of entertainment as a method for processing his own psychological issues, while maintaining sufficient distance from the content to avoid genuine emotional engagement with the suffering or joy of beings, whose experiences were being broadcast for his amusement. The role of chance and randomness in species development was particularly apparent in the interdimensional cable broadcasts, which revealed realities where minor historical variations or random genetic mutations had produced civilizations that were fundamentally different from any that had developed in more familiar dimensions, suggesting that the apparent logic and inevitability of evolutionary processes were actually artifacts of limited perspective rather than universal principles. Cultural exchange through interdimensional broadcasting was limited by the fundamental incompatibility of most entertainment content with the psychological and cultural frameworks of species other than those that had produced it, creating a situation where infinite varieties of artistic expression were theoretically available but practically inaccessible to most potential audiences. Due to barriers in communication, aesthetic appreciation, and basic comprehension, the Cronenberg reality television programs that occasionally appeared in interdimensional cable lineups revealed species that had evolved to find beauty and entertainment value in biological processes and physical transformations that most other conscious beings would consider horrifying or disgusting, demonstrating the complete relativity of aesthetic judgments and the impossibility of establishing universal standards for artistic merit or entertainment value. The interdimensional news broadcasts that Rick and Morty encountered provided glimpses into realities where current events and social problems took forms that were completely alien to human experience, but followed recognizable patterns of political conflict, social change, and cultural development that suggested universal principles underlying the apparent chaos and randomness of interdimensional variety. The Jan Michael Vincent dimension represented an extreme example of celebrity culture taken to its logical conclusion, where individual identity and social organization had been completely restructured around the worship and imitation of a single entertainment figure whose cultural significance had transcended normal boundaries between performer and audience to become the organizing principle of an entire civilization. The long-term consequences of unlimited access to interdimensional entertainment remained unclear, but the psychological effects observed in regular viewers suggested that exposure to infinite varieties of content might fundamentally alter consciousness in ways that made normal social relationships and cultural participation increasingly difficult, creating new forms of isolation and alienation that were specific to beings with access to interdimensional broadcast technology. The philosophical implications of interdimensional cable extended beyond questions about entertainment and cultural development to encompass fundamental issues about reality, identity, and the nature of authentic experience in contexts where unlimited alternatives were available for every possible form of content, relationship, or life experience, making genuine choice and commitment increasingly difficult for beings whose awareness of infinite alternatives undermined their capacity for satisfaction with any particular option. The infinite variations of Earth that existed across the boundless expanse of realities, accessible through Rick's portal technology, represented perhaps the most psychologically complex aspect of his interdimensional experiences, forcing him to confront countless versions of the world he had lost when Rick Prime murdered his original family, while simultaneously providing him with endless opportunities to observe how human development might have proceeded under different historical circumstances and evolutionary pressures. The human species that had developed in Dimension C-137 represented just one possible outcome among infinite variations of evolutionary paths that had produced beings recognizably human in their basic psychological and biological characteristics, but fundamentally different in their cultural achievements, technological capabilities, and approaches to the fundamental problems of existence that had shaped their development across different timelines and environmental conditions. How different historical events had created distinct human subspecies was most dramatically illustrated in dimensions where major catastrophes, technological breakthroughs, or social revolutions had occurred at different points in human development, creating branching evolutionary paths that led to versions of humanity with radically different physical characteristics, cognitive capabilities, and cultural values, while maintaining sufficient similarity to Rick's original species that meaningful interaction remained possible. The dimension where humans had evolved additional limbs due to prolonged exposure to specific environmental toxins had developed technologies and social structures that were perfectly adapted to their unique physiology, but completely incompatible with the needs and capabilities of standard human variants, creating civilizations that were simultaneously familiar and alien when viewed from the perspective of beings whose evolutionary development had followed different trajectories. Rick's impact on human evolution across multiple dimensions was profound and largely destructive, as his technological interventions and casual disregard for long-term consequences frequently accelerated or disrupted natural developmental processes in ways that benefited his immediate objectives, while creating problems that affected entire planetary populations for generations after his departure from their realities. The relationship between humans and other Earth species variants reflected the infinite creativity with which evolution had solved the problems of consciousness and intelligence, producing realities where dolphins had achieved technological civilization while humans remained primitive hunter-gatherers, or where plants had developed collective consciousness that encompassed entire continental ecosystems, while animal life served primarily as mobile sensory organs for vegetative intelligence networks, the dimension where dogs had evolved human-level intelligence and established civilizations based on pack loyalty and territorial cooperation, provided insights into how different basic psychological characteristics might shape the development of technology, art, and social organization. When applied by species with cognitive capabilities equivalent to humans, but fundamentally different instinctual behaviors and emotional needs. How Rick's presence accelerated or disrupted natural development was most apparent in dimensions where his technological gifts or casual interventions had enabled human civilizations to achieve advances that were centuries or millennia ahead of their natural developmental timeline, creating social and psychological stresses that their cultural and institutional frameworks were unprepared to handle effectively. Dimension-specific threats that had shaped human evolution included cosmic radiation events that had enhanced human cognitive capabilities at the cost of dramatically reduced lifespans, creating civilizations where intense intellectual achievement was concentrated into brief periods of frantic activity before inevitable death from radiation-induced cellular breakdown. The role of technology in human species divergence was particularly apparent in dimensions where early access to advanced tools had enabled humans to modify their own biology through genetic engineering or cybernetic enhancement, creating subspecies that were no longer entirely biological but maintained recognizable human consciousness and cultural patterns adapted to their transformed physical capabilities. Cross-dimensional human migration had created hybrid communities where humans from different evolutionary paths attempted to establish cooperative civilizations despite fundamental differences in their biological needs, cognitive structures, and cultural values, producing experimental social arrangements that were often unstable but occasionally achieved remarkable innovations in governance and resource allocation. How other species viewed the infinite variance of humanity revealed the extent to which Rick's dimensional activities had made human variant civilizations notorious throughout the multiverse as sources of unpredictable innovation and dangerous instability, with many alien species developing specific protocols for managing contact with human variant civilizations due to their tendency toward rapid technological advancement, combined with poor long-term planning and ethical reasoning. The significance of Earth in the broader multiverse ecosystem was primarily related to its function as Rick Sanchez's species of origin, making Earth variants particularly important to other Ricks while remaining relatively insignificant to cosmic entities and civilizations that operated on scales where individual planetary development was too small to merit attention or consideration. Rick's preference for certain human variants over others was largely determined by their utility for his projects and their compatibility with his psychological needs, rather than any objective assessment of their cultural achievements or moral development, leading him to favor dimensions where humans were sufficiently advanced to provide interesting challenges while remaining dependent enough to accept his authority and guidance. The Cronenberg dimension represented perhaps the most extreme example of Rick's impact on human development, where his love potion experiment had transformed the entire human population into grotesque mutant creatures whose biology and behavior were so altered that they no longer qualified as recognizably human, despite retaining some memory and consciousness patterns from their original existence. The future evolution of humanity under Rick's influence remained unpredictable, but was likely to involve continued acceleration of technological development, combined with increasing psychological instability and social dysfunction, as human civilization struggled to adapt to capabilities and knowledge that exceeded their natural evolutionary preparation for handling advanced technology responsibly. The Smith family variants that Rick encountered across different dimensions provided insights into how his own family relationships might have developed under different circumstances, revealing both the consistency of certain personality patterns across dimensional boundaries and the profound impact that specific historical events and choices had on individual psychological development and family dynamics. The Jerry variants that existed across multiple dimensions demonstrated the remarkable consistency of certain personality characteristics despite radically different life experiences, suggesting that basic psychological patterns were more resistant to environmental influence than might be expected, while also revealing how small changes in circumstances could produce dramatically different life outcomes for individuals with identical fundamental characteristics. The Beth variants that Rick observed across dimensions forced him to confront the reality that his daughter's intelligence and creativity were universal constants that existed independently of his influence, while her relationship with him varied dramatically, depending on the specific circumstances of their interaction and his level of involvement in her development during crucial formative periods. The summer variants that appeared in some dimensions but not others revealed the contingent nature of individual existence within infinite realities, demonstrating how seemingly fundamental aspects of family structure and individual identity were actually dependent on specific sequences of choices and events that could easily have developed differently under alternative circumstances. The Morty variants that served as companions to different Ricks across the multiverse displayed a range of psychological development and moral reasoning that reflected both their individual potential and the corrupting or beneficial influence of their respective Rick relationships, providing evidence for both the universality of certain human characteristics and the profound impact of mentorship and guidance on adolescent development. The dimension where Rick had never developed portal technology represented a baseline for understanding how human civilization might have developed without his technological interventions, revealing both the benefits of his scientific contributions and the costs of his psychological instability and moral flexibility when applied to species-wide development patterns. The post-apocalyptic human variants that had survived various catastrophic events across different dimensions demonstrated remarkable adaptability and resilience, while also revealing how environmental pressures could rapidly reshape human society and culture in directions that prioritized survival over traditional values like individual rights, artistic achievement, or technological advancement. The relationship between dimensional travel and human psychological development was complex and largely negative, as exposure to infinite alternatives and the knowledge that every possible version of existence was available somewhere across the multiverse typically undermined human capacity for commitment, satisfaction, and meaningful engagement with particular relationships or life circumstances. The preservation of human cultural diversity across dimensions was threatened by Rick's tendency to treat human variants as interchangeable resources rather than unique civilizations deserving of protection and respect, leading to homogenization pressures that eliminated distinctive cultural achievements in favor of characteristics that were useful for Rick's projects or compatible with his psychological needs and preferences. The Squanch species represented one of the most linguistically fascinating civilizations that Rick and Morty encountered during their interdimensional travels, having evolved a communication system so fundamentally different from conventional language structures that it challenged every assumption about the relationship between consciousness, meaning, and the symbolic representation of complex ideas through vocalized sounds and gestural expressions. Birdperson's friend Squanch had developed his species' unique linguistic approach, where a single vocalized sound could convey an enormous range of meanings, emotions, and conceptual relationships depending on subtle variations in tone, context, timing, and the psychological state of both speaker and listener, creating a form of communication that was simultaneously more efficient and more ambiguous than the discrete word-based systems that most species had evolved for managing complex social interactions and knowledge transmission. The linguistic structure that enabled Squanch's species to communicate effectively, using primarily variations of a single sound, required cognitive capabilities and cultural frameworks that were radically different from those that supported conventional language systems, suggesting that their evolutionary development had followed pathways that prioritized intuitive understanding and emotional resonance over the precise conceptual distinctions that characterized most advanced civilizations' approaches to information processing and social coordination. How different species had evolved distinct communication methods reflected the infinite creativity with which consciousness had solved the fundamental problem of sharing internal mental states with other beings, producing solutions that ranged from telepathic transmission of complete thought patterns to elaborate chemical signaling systems that conveyed information through combinations of molecular structures released into shared atmospheric or aquatic environments. The role of language in shaping alien consciousness and culture was particularly apparent in species whose communication systems had evolved to include concepts and categories that were completely absent from human linguistic traditions, creating forms of awareness and social organization that were literally unthinkable for beings whose mental development had been constrained by the vocabulary and grammatical structures available within their native communication systems. Species with non-verbal communication systems had developed remarkable sophistication in conveying complex information through visual displays, electromagnetic emissions, or direct manipulation of environmental conditions, creating cultures where artistic expression and practical communication were seamlessly integrated rather than treated as separate categories of mental activity and social interaction. The crystalline beings from the Proxima Centauri sectors communicated primarily through modulated light patterns that conveyed not only conceptual information but also emotional states, aesthetic judgments, and complex mathematical relationships simultaneously, creating a form of language that was more similar to music or visual art than to the sequential word-based systems that most biological species had developed for managing social coordination and knowledge preservation. How translation technology affected interspecies relations was complicated by the fact that many forms of alien communication included concepts, emotional ranges, and categories of experience that simply had no equivalent in other species' linguistic or cognitive frameworks, making accurate translation impossible rather than merely difficult and creating persistent sources of misunderstanding and conflict between civilizations that appeared to be communicating successfully. The preservation of linguistic diversity across the multiverse was threatened by the homogenizing influence of translation technologies and interdimensional contact, as species that encountered more efficient or sophisticated communication systems often abandoned their traditional linguistic approaches in favor of methods that provided better compatibility with galactic commerce and diplomatic relations. Rick's facility with alien languages reflected both his exceptional intelligence and his extensive exposure to different forms of consciousness during his years of interdimensional travel, but his approach to communication was typically instrumental rather than appreciative, focusing on achieving specific practical objectives rather than understanding or respecting the cultural and psychological frameworks that had shaped different species' approaches to language and meaning. Species that communicated through methods incomprehensible to humans included beings whose language consisted entirely of controlled gravitational fluctuations that conveyed information through the manipulation of space-time curvature around their bodies, creating communication systems that required technological enhancement for other species to detect or interpret, even at the most basic levels. The evolution of universal translator technology had created both opportunities and problems for interspecies relations, enabling communication between radically different forms of consciousness, while also creating dependencies on technological systems that could fail or be manipulated by beings with superior technical capabilities or hostile intentions toward particular species or civilizations. How language barriers created and resolved conflicts between species was particularly apparent in cases where fundamental conceptual differences made certain types of negotiation or cooperation impossible regardless of the sophistication of available translation technologies, as some disputes arose not from miscommunication but from genuinely incompatible approaches to concepts like individual identity, moral responsibility, and the nature of consciousness itself. The role of linguistic evolution in species development was demonstrated by civilizations that had consciously modified their communication systems to enhance their problem-solving capabilities or social coordination, creating artificial languages that were optimized for specific purposes like scientific research, artistic expression, or collective decision-making, rather than evolved naturally through cultural and biological pressures. Cultural concepts that existed only in specific alien languages included ideas about temporal relationships, consciousness, and social organization that were so foreign to human conceptual frameworks that they could not be adequately translated or explained using human vocabulary, creating knowledge barriers that prevented meaningful cultural exchange. Despite the availability of sophisticated translation technologies, the Galactic Federation's approach to linguistic standardization had attempted to create universal communication protocols that could facilitate commerce and diplomacy across species boundaries while preserving important cultural and conceptual distinctions that were essential for maintaining the psychological health and social cohesion of member civilizations. The philosophical implications of radical linguistic diversity across species raised fundamental questions about the relationship between language and thought, suggesting that consciousness itself might take fundamentally different forms depending on the communication systems that shaped mental development during crucial formative periods of individual and cultural growth. The plumbous manufacturing species had developed technical vocabularies that included thousands of precise terms for describing manufacturing processes, quality control standards, and product variations that were completely incomprehensible to beings who had not been immersed in their industrial culture from birth, demonstrating how specialized knowledge could create linguistic barriers, even within apparently universal communication systems. The diplomatic challenges created by linguistic incompatibility were particularly severe in cases where species needed to coordinate responses to cosmic-scale threats or opportunities, but lacked the conceptual frameworks necessary for understanding each other's perspectives on fundamental questions about strategy, resource allocation, and acceptable levels of risk or sacrifice. The relationship between communication systems and technological development was complex and varied significantly across species, with some civilizations achieving remarkable technological sophistication despite relatively primitive linguistic capabilities, while others had developed elaborate communication systems but remained limited in their ability to manipulate their physical environment or develop advanced tools and machines. The psychological impact of exposure to alien communication systems on individuals from linguistically limited species could be profound and sometimes harmful, as contact with radically different approaches to organizing and expressing thought could undermine basic assumptions about reality and identity that were necessary for maintaining mental stability and social functioning. The Cronenberg creatures that had once been human retained fragmentary linguistic capabilities from their original existence, but had developed new communication methods that were adapted to their transformed physiology and altered psychological needs, creating hybrid language systems that preserved some human conceptual frameworks while incorporating entirely alien approaches to expressing their current experiences and relationships. The long-term evolution of communication across the multiverse appeared to be moving toward greater complexity and sophistication rather than standardization, as species that encountered alien linguistic systems typically developed expanded communication capabilities that incorporated useful elements from multiple traditions, rather than abandoning their original approaches in favor of more efficient or universal alternatives. The role of language in preserving cultural identity across generations was particularly important for species that had been displaced from their original environments or had undergone significant biological or technological changes that threatened their traditional ways of organizing social relationships and transmitting knowledge from older to younger members of their communities. The profound and largely unintended impact that Rick Sanchez variants had exerted on alien evolutionary processes across infinite dimensions represented perhaps the most complex and morally troubling aspect of his multiversal activities, as his technological interventions and casual disregard for long-term consequences had fundamentally altered the natural development trajectories of countless species whose existence he had encountered during his decades of interdimensional travel and scientific experimentation. How Rick's presence accelerated or disrupted natural species development was most dramatically apparent in civilizations that had been exposed to his advanced technologies during crucial periods of their evolutionary history, when access to portal travel, energy weapons, or genetic modification techniques had enabled these species to achieve capabilities that were millennia ahead of their natural developmental timeline, while lacking the cultural wisdom and institutional frameworks necessary for managing such powerful tools responsibly. The Gazapazorpians represented a prime example of a species whose natural evolutionary trajectory had been permanently altered by Rick's interventions, as his provision of advanced weaponry to the male population and his genetic contributions to their reproductive cycle had accelerated their divergent development in ways that made peaceful reunification between their gender-divided civilizations increasingly unlikely with each passing generation. Species that had evolved specifically to interact with Rick-level beings demonstrated remarkable adaptability in developing psychological and physiological characteristics that enabled them to survive and even thrive in relationships with entities whose technological capabilities and moral flexibility made them extraordinarily dangerous to most forms of consciousness that had evolved under normal environmental pressures and social constraints. The unintended consequences of Rick's technological interventions extended far beyond the immediate recipients of his gifts or assistance to encompass entire ecological and social systems that had been destabilized by the introduction of capabilities that exceeded their natural evolutionary preparation for handling advanced tools, weapons, or scientific knowledge without destroying themselves through misuse or internal conflict. The Purge planet civilization had been fundamentally transformed by Rick and Morty's disruption of their traditional violence regulation systems, leading to ongoing social chaos that had eliminated the careful balance between aggression and cooperation that had sustained their culture for centuries, demonstrating how external intervention could destroy sophisticated social arrangements even when the interventions were intended to be helpful or corrective. How different species adapted to or resisted Rick's influence revealed remarkable diversity in the psychological and cultural resources that various forms of consciousness could mobilize when faced with challenges that exceeded anything their evolutionary history had prepared them to handle, with some species proving remarkably resilient while others were completely overwhelmed by exposure to Rick-level capabilities and knowledge. The creation of hybrid species through Rick's experiments had produced beings that combined characteristics from multiple evolutionary lineages in ways that were both fascinating and deeply troubling, as these artificial creatures often possessed remarkable capabilities, while suffering from psychological instabilities and identity confusion that reflected the fundamental incompatibilities between their component biological and cultural elements. Species that had been permanently altered by Rick encounters included civilizations whose entire social structures had been reorganized around the maintenance and operation of Rick-provided technologies, creating dependencies that made them unable to function independently, while also making them valuable targets for exploitation by other Rick variants, who recognized the strategic advantages of controlling technologically dependent populations. The role of Rick variants in guiding or corrupting alien civilizations was complicated by the fundamental inconsistency in Rick behavior across dimensions, as some Rick variants had used their capabilities to accelerate beneficial social development, while others had deliberately fostered chaos, violence, and exploitation for their own amusement or strategic advantage, creating highly variable outcomes even when similar species encountered similar levels of Rick intervention. How the multiverse's species diversity reflected infinite Rick variants was perhaps most apparent in the existence of civilizations that had evolved specifically in response to Rick presence, developing cultural institution, defensive technology, and social organization patterns that were optimized for managing relationships with beings possessing Rick-level intelligence and moral flexibility, rather than for dealing with more conventional forms of interspecies contact and cooperation. The ethical implications of Rick's impact on natural evolution were staggering in their scope and complexity, as his activities had affected not just individual species, but entire categories of evolutionary development across vast numbers of dimensions, creating selection pressures and environmental changes that would influence the development of consciousness and civilization for millions of years beyond his own lifespan and activities. Species that had developed Rick-specific defense mechanisms demonstrated remarkable sophistication in creating technologies and social protocols that could provide some protection against beings whose capabilities made conventional military or diplomatic approaches to conflict resolution largely ineffective, though such defensive measures were typically only partially successful and often came at enormous costs to the species that implemented them. The long-term evolutionary consequences of interdimensional travel on species development remained largely unpredictable, as the introduction of infinite alternatives and possibilities into previously closed evolutionary systems created chaotic dynamics that could lead to rapid advancement, complete civilizational collapse, or transformation into forms of existence that bore little resemblance to the original species' natural developmental trajectory. How Rick's actions rippled across species development patterns was particularly apparent in cases where his intervention in one civilization had created technologies or ideas that were subsequently transmitted to other species through trade, conquest, or cultural exchange, creating cascading effects that spread Rick influence far beyond the direct recipients of his attention or assistance. The formation of anti-Rick alliances among various alien species represented recognition that the threat posed by Rick-level beings exceeded anything that individual civilizations could address through independent action, requiring unprecedented levels of interspecies cooperation and resource sharing to develop countermeasures that might be effective against beings who possessed essentially godlike technological capabilities. The psychological trauma that Rick encounters had inflicted on entire species was evident in the development of cultural traditions, religious beliefs, and social institutions that were specifically designed to help process and manage the existential terror that accompanied awareness of beings whose power and indifference to conventional moral constraints made them effectively cosmic forces of chaos and destruction. The emergence of Rick-worshipping cults among various alien species reflected the tendency of some forms of consciousness to respond to incomprehensible power through religious devotion rather than resistance or accommodation, creating new forms of theological and philosophical frameworks that attempted to find meaning and purpose in submission to beings whose motivations and objectives remained fundamentally alien and unpredictable. The technological archaeology that could be observed in dimensions where Rick had been active for extended periods revealed layers of abandoned projects, failed experiments, and discarded innovations that had accumulated over decades of casual invention and modification, creating technological landscapes that were simultaneously advanced, beyond most species' comprehension, and utterly chaotic in their organization and implementation. The species that had achieved independence from Rick influence through their own technological advancement represented remarkable examples of civilizational resilience and determination, having managed to develop capabilities that enabled them to interact with Rick variants as something approaching equals rather than remaining permanently dependent on Rick guidance or protection. The cultural renaissance that some species experienced after liberation from Rick control demonstrated the extent to which his presence had constrained their natural development, as the removal of Rick influence often led to explosive growth in artistic achievement, philosophical sophistication, and social innovation that had been suppressed during periods of technological dependence. The interdisciplinary research collaborations that had emerged between species seeking to understand and predict Rick behavior represented unprecedented achievements in interspecies scientific cooperation, creating new fields of study that combine psychology, technology assessment, and strategic planning in ways that no individual species could have developed independently. The memorial sites that had been established by species who had suffered particularly severe losses during Rick encounters served both as monuments to the victims of his casual violence and as warnings to future generations about the dangers inherent in contact with beings whose power exceeded their wisdom and whose intelligence was not constrained by proportional moral development or concern for the welfare of others. The philosophical schools that had developed in response to Rick influence often focused on questions about the relationship between intelligence and morality, the responsibilities that accompanied great power, and the possibility of maintaining meaning and purpose in existence when faced with evidence that the universe contained beings whose capabilities made conventional concepts of justice, fairness, and individual significance largely obsolete. The long-term goal of many anti-Rick species alliances was not simply defense against specific Rick variants, but the development of universal principles and institutions that could provide stability and protection for developing civilizations throughout the multiverse, creating frameworks for cosmic governance that could manage the challenges posed by beings with Rick-level capabilities while preserving the diversity and autonomy that made civilizational development meaningful and worthwhile. As we conclude our journey through the infinite tapestry of alien life that fills Rick and Morty's multiverse, we're reminded that consciousness takes countless forms across dimensions, from the collective minds of hive mind species to the individual brilliance of cosmic entities. Each alien civilization represents a unique answer to the fundamental questions of existence. These species, in all their strange beauty and terrifying complexity, serve as mirrors reflecting our own humanity back at us, sometimes comfortingly familiar, sometimes utterly alien, but always profoundly meaningful. Rick's interactions with these countless forms of life reveal both the universality of certain experiences, love, loss, the search for meaning, and the infinite creativity of existence itself. As you drift towards sleep, let your mind wander among these alien worlds and strange civilizations, knowing that somewhere across infinite realities, beings utterly unlike us are looking up at their own alien stars and wondering about the nature of existence. Rest peacefully in the knowledge that the universe is vast, strange, and filled with wonders beyond human comprehension. Sweet dreams among the infinite species of the multiverse.